To the old lady who won't be needing her house much longer, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said, raising her glass with a smile so polished it almost looked kind. And for a moment, the room held its breath. Forks paused midair, conversations fading into a silence so thin I could hear the soft hum of the ceiling fan above us. And I felt every pair of eyes flicker toward me before quickly looking away, as if embarrassment itself were contagious. I smiled back, the same gentle smile I had worn through decades of family dinners, scraped knees, and late-night phone calls, and I even lifted my iced tea slightly in return, as though her words had been nothing more than a harmless joke, something light enough to dissolve in laughter, though no one actually laughed. Not really. Not in the way people do when something is genuinely funny, because deep down, they all understood what had just happened, even if no one dared to name it. And across the table, my son Daniel let out a quiet chuckle, the kind that tries to smooth things over without ever challenging the source, his eyes briefly meeting mine before sliding away. Choosing comfort over confrontation as he always had in recent years. It was my grandson Ethan's 8th birthday, and the dining room was decorated with bright blue streamers and a cake shaped like a baseball field sitting proudly at the center of the table, the frosting still untouched, candles waiting patiently for a moment that suddenly felt far less joyful than it should have been. And I had arrived early that morning with a wrapped gift and a small envelope tucked carefully into my purse, something I had planned to give him later, something meaningful, because that's what grandmothers do. We prepare, we show up, we make sure everything feels special even when no one notices the effort behind it. And yet as I sat there, listening to Vanessa continue her toast with light-hearted comments about making room for the next generation and knowing when to step aside, I realized that this wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't a slip of the tongue or a poorly judged attempt at humor. It was deliberate, crafted, rehearsed in the quiet spaces where I was no longer invited. And I felt it settle inside me not as a sharp pain, but as something colder, heavier, like a truth finally finding its shape. I reached for my napkin, smoothing it over my lap with steady hands, grateful that no one could see the slight tremor beneath the table. And I nodded politely when Vanessa finished, even offering a soft, that was thoughtful. Because dignity, I had learned, is not about correcting others in the moment. It's about choosing when silence carries more weight than words. And as the room slowly returned to its earlier noise, conversations picking up like nothing had happened, I sat there watching them all. My family, my son, the woman who had just reduced me to a timeline. And I understood something with a clarity I hadn't allowed myself before. They thought I was fading, that I was already halfway gone, that my role in this family was quietly closing without my consent. And I didn't correct them, not then, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people believe their own version of the story, right up until the moment it no longer serves them. I stayed just long enough to sing happy birthday, my voice steady and warm as if nothing had shifted beneath my feet, and I watched Ethan grin as he blew out his candles, his small face lit with the kind of joy that only comes once a year, the kind that deserves to be protected from the undercurrents adults create without thinking about the children who will one day remember everything. And when the cake was sliced and plates were passed around, I excused myself quietly, placing my untouched fork beside the napkin and offering a gentle kiss to the top of Ethan's head before slipping my coat over my shoulders. No one stopped me. Not Daniel. Not Vanessa. Not even the relatives who had watched the toast unfold with polite discomfort. And that silence followed me all the way to my car, where I sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, feeling the stillness settle in. Not heavy this time. Not suffocating. But clear, like a window finally wiped clean. The drive home took 20 minutes, the same familiar route lined with maple trees just beginning to turn, there. Leaves catching the late afternoon light in shades of gold and amber, and I realized I had driven this road thousands of times over the years, carrying groceries, picking up Daniel from school, rushing home to cook dinner, always with a sense of purpose tied to someone else's needs. And yet today, for the first time in a long while, I was not rushing at all. When I stepped into the house, the quiet greeted me like an old friend, the kind that does not ask questions or demand explanations, and I set my purse on the kitchen counter before removing my coat slowly, folding it with care, because small rituals have a way of grounding you when everything else feels uncertain. I poured myself a glass of water, took a sip, and then another, letting the coolness steady me. And as I stood there, I began to replay the afternoon, not with emotion, but with attention, noticing details I had once overlooked. The way Vanessa had glanced at Daniel before raising her glass, the subtle nod he gave her, as if to signal that it was safe to proceed, the confidence in her tone that comes from believing there will be no consequences, and the realization settled in quietly, but firmly, that what I had witnessed was not a moment of carelessness. It was a performance built on assumption, the assumption that I would remain exactly as I had always been, agreeable, forgiving, willing to smooth over discomfort for the sake of keeping the peace. I walked into the living room and paused by the window, looking out at the backyard where Daniel used to play as a child, where I had once stood with his father watching him learn to ride a bicycle, our hands ready to catch him if he fell, and I wondered when exactly that instinct to protect had been replaced by a willingness to look away, because somewhere along the line, my son had learned that silence was easier than standing up for what was right, and perhaps I had taught him that without meaning to, by always choosing harmony over honesty. I turned away from the window and made my way down the hallway, my steps unhurried, my thoughts precise, and by the time I reached my bedroom, I knew that the version of myself they had relied on, the one who absorbed every slight without question, no longer served me, not in this moment, not moving forward. And I sat at the edge of the bed, opening my purse to retrieve the small envelope I had brought for Ethan, running my fingers along its edge before setting it gently on the nightstand, because there would be another time to give it to him, a better moment, one not overshadowed by something meant to diminish me. I leaned back slightly, allowing myself a single deep breath, and in that quiet space, with no audience and no need to perform, I made a decision that did not require anger or raised voices, only clarity, because dignity is not something you ask for, it is something you protect, and from that point on, I would no longer assume that my place in this family was secure simply because it had always been there. I would make sure it was defined on my terms, not quietly rewritten by someone who believed I would not notice. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a thin line of sunlight slipping through the curtains and stretching quietly across the hardwood floor, and I woke earlier than usual, not because I could not sleep, but because my mind had already begun arranging thoughts into something more structured, more deliberate, the way it used to when I managed a household full of moving parts and needed everything to run smoothly, without anyone noticing the effort behind it. I made my way to the kitchen, the familiar rhythm of preparing coffee grounding me as the machine hummed softly, and I stood there watching the steam rise, thinking not about what had been said the day before, but about what had been revealed, because there is a difference. One is a moment, the other is a pattern, and patterns, once seen, cannot be unseen. As I carried my cup to the small breakfast table by the window, I noticed my phone resting where I had left it, silent, undisturbed, no message from Daniel asking if I had gotten home safely, no casual follow-up to smooth over the discomfort, and that absence spoke louder than anything he could have said, confirming what I had already begun to understand, that in his world now, my feelings were optional, something to be acknowledged only if it did not disrupt the balance he had chosen. I sat down slowly, wrapping my hands around the warm mug, and let my thoughts drift back through the years, not in a sentimental way, but with a kind of careful observation, tracing the subtle shifts that had brought us here. The first time Vanessa had suggested changing holiday plans without consulting me, the way Daniel had agreed without hesitation, the small jokes that placed me just slightly outside the circle, always framed as harmless, always dismissed if questioned, and how I had responded each time with a smile, telling myself that families evolve, that younger generations have different ways, that it was not worth creating tension over small things, and yet those small things had accumulated, layer by layer, until they formed something solid enough to stand on, something Vanessa clearly believed would support whatever she intended to build next. I took a sip of coffee, letting the bitterness settle on my tongue, and as I set the cup down, I heard a faint vibration against the table, my phone lighting up with a notification, a message from Vanessa, brief and carefully worded. "Hope you made it home okay yesterday. We should talk soon about making things easier for everyone." And I read it twice, noting the phrasing, the way concern was paired with an implication, the assumption that there was something to discuss about my place. my future, my independence, as though those decisions were already in motion and I was simply being invited to cooperate. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I placed the phone back down and leaned back in my chair, allowing the silence to stretch just a little longer, because timing, I had learned, matters just as much as action, and responding too quickly would place me back into the role they expected, reactive, accommodating, predictable. After a few minutes, I stood and walked toward the hallway, pausing briefly at the small desk where I kept important documents, my fingers brushing over the polished wood before opening the top drawer, revealing neatly organized folders, each one labeled in my own handwriting, years of careful planning and record-keeping that no one had ever questioned, because no one had ever needed to. And as I pulled one folder slightly forward, not opening it yet, just acknowledging its presence, I felt a quiet certainty take hold, not dramatic, not rushed, but steady, the kind that does not need validation from anyone else. I closed the drawer gently and returned to the kitchen, finishing my coffee in unhurried sips. And when I finally picked up my phone again, I typed a simple reply. Of course, Vanessa, we will talk soon. My tone calm, agreeable, exactly what she would expect, because for now, it was important that nothing about me appeared different, not until I understood fully what they believed they had already secured, and more importantly, what they had overlooked. Later that afternoon, I drove across town to a place I had not visited in nearly 2 years, a quiet office building tucked between a dental clinic and a small insurance agency. The kind of place most people pass without noticing, and yet it held something far more substantial than its modest exterior suggested, something built on signatures and decisions that outlast conversations and promises. I parked carefully, smoothing my hands over the steering wheel before stepping out, not out of hesitation but out of intention, because every movement now carried a sense of purpose I had not felt in a long time. And as I walked through the glass doors, the familiar scent of polished wood and paper greeted me, grounding me in a way that felt almost reassuring. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile, her expression shifting slightly as recognition settled in. "Mrs. Collins, it has been a while," she said, and I returned her smile with the same calm warmth I had perfected over decades. "It has, but I believe it is time I reviewed a few things." And she nodded, already reaching for the phone to announce my arrival. As I waited, seated in a chair that felt both familiar and distant, I let my gaze drift over the framed certificates lining the wall, each one representing a layer of structure, of order, of clarity, and I realized how easily people underestimate what they cannot see, how assumptions are often built on the absence of visible resistance rather than the absence of actual control. When Mr. Henderson stepped into the room, his expression carried both professionalism and a quiet curiosity. "Margaret, it is good to see you," he said, extending his hand, and I accepted it firmly, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that needed no explanation. "I believe it is time we go over everything again," I replied, and as we walked into his office, closing the door behind us, I felt a subtle shift, as though I had stepped into a space where narratives could be rewritten without raising a single voice. He began pulling out documents, neatly organized, each page a reflection of decisions made years ago, decisions I had carefully considered at the time, not out of distrust, but out of responsibility, because I had always believed that clarity was a form of protection, not just for myself, but for the family I had spent a lifetime supporting. As he reviewed the details, explaining what remained unchanged and what could be adjusted, I listened closely, not because I did not understand, but because understanding now carried a different weight. And when he paused, asking if there was anything specific I wished to modify, I allowed a brief moment of silence before answering, choosing my words with precision. "I would like to ensure that everything reflects intention, not assumption." And he nodded slowly, as though recognizing that this was not simply a routine review, but a deliberate recalibration. Outside, the afternoon light had softened, casting long shadows across the parking lot, and when I eventually stepped back into that light, the folder in my hands felt no heavier than before, but something inside me had settled into place, something quiet and resolute. Because while others had been planning conversations about my future, I had just ensured that my future would not be something they could casually arrange. And as I walked back to my car, I understood that the next time we all sat at the same table, It would not be me who was being quietly repositioned, but them who would have to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The following day moved forward with a quiet precision that felt almost unfamiliar, as if I were stepping into a role I had always been capable of playing but had never fully embraced. And when Vanessa called that afternoon, her tone carried that same polished warmth she used in public, the kind that sounds considerate on the surface but leaves no room for disagreement underneath. "Margaret, I was thinking it might be good for us to sit down and talk about what comes next, just to make things easier for everyone," she said, and I could almost hear the carefully arranged intentions behind her words, each one placed to sound reasonable, to make resistance feel unnecessary, and I responded in the same measured tone I had used in my message. "Of course, that sounds like a good idea," allowing a slight pause before adding, "Why do you not come by on Sunday? We can have a proper conversation." Because it mattered that the setting be mine, that the ground beneath that conversation belonged to me. She agreed quickly, almost too quickly, and when the call ended, I set the phone down with a calmness that felt earned rather than forced, knowing that she believed this meeting would follow the same pattern as every other interaction we had shared, where I listened, nodded, and eventually adjusted myself to fit whatever arrangement had already been decided without me. The rest of the afternoon unfolded quietly. I moved through the house with intention, not rushing, not hesitating, straightening small things that did not need straightening, aligning picture frames, clearing surfaces, actions that might have seemed ordinary but carried a deeper purpose now, because control is often expressed in the smallest details, and by the time evening settled in, everything felt exactly as it should, not staged, but ready. Sunday arrived with a soft gray sky and a light breeze that carried the scent of early fall through the open kitchen window, and I prepared lunch as I always had. Nothing elaborate, just simple dishes arranged with care. Because appearances matter, especially when people expect you to remain predictable, and when the doorbell rang just after noon, I dried my hands on a clean towel before walking to the door, opening it with the same gentle expression I had worn for years. "Vanessa, Daniel, come in," I said, stepping aside to let them pass, noting the way Vanessa's eyes moved quickly through the space, assessing, measuring, as though she were already imagining changes that had not yet been discussed. We sat at the table, the same one that had held birthdays and holidays, laughter and quiet conversations, and for a moment, there was a pause, the kind that often comes before someone takes control of the narrative, and as expected, Vanessa began, her voice calm, composed. "Margaret, we have been thinking about what might be best for you moving forward," she said, folding her hands neatly in front of her, and I listened without interrupting, my posture relaxed, my expression open, giving her exactly what she expected, because sometimes the most effective way to understand someone's intentions is to let them unfold without resistance. And as she continued, outlining suggestions about downsizing, about supportive communities, about making sure I was not overwhelmed, I nodded thoughtfully, even asking a few gentle questions that encouraged her to elaborate further, watching as her confidence grew with each word, as though agreement had already been secured, and beside her, Daniel remained mostly silent, adding occasional remarks that echoed her points, his voice carrying that same quiet certainty that comes from believing a decision has already been made. When she finally paused, looking at me with an expression that suggested expectation, I allowed a brief moment of silence to settle between us, just long enough for the weight of her words to linger, and then I smiled, not in defiance, not in submission, but in something steadier, something that did not need to announce itself, because while she believed this conversation was about my future, I already knew that what mattered most had been decided elsewhere, in a place she had not yet considered, and I intended to let her continue believing exactly that, at least for now. Vanessa's voice softened slightly as she continued, as though she were offering reassurance rather than direction, explaining how certain communities had activities, social circles, even transportation services that would make life easier. And I listened with the same attentive calm I had maintained from the beginning, nodding occasionally, asking just enough to keep her speaking, because the more she explained, the clearer the structure of her thinking became, not just what she wanted, but how certain she was that she would get it. Daniel finally leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on the table, his tone careful, almost rehearsed. "Mom, we just want to make sure you are not taking on too much with the house. It is a lot to manage," he said, and I met his eyes briefly, seeing not hostility, not even impatience, but something more distant, a kind of quiet detachment that had settled in over time, as if he had already accepted a version of the future where I was no longer at the center of it. I folded my hands neatly in front of me, mirroring Vanessa's posture from earlier, and let a small breath pass before responding. "I understand your concerns," I said gently, my voice steady, measured, giving them exactly what they expected to hear, because agreement, when used carefully, can be far more revealing than resistance. And I watched as Vanessa's shoulders relaxed just slightly, her confidence strengthening as she sensed no immediate pushback. She began outlining more specifics then, speaking about timelines, about exploring options sooner rather than later, about making decisions while everything was still manageable, each phrase carrying an assumption that the decision itself had already been made, and I allowed her to continue uninterrupted, because there is a certain clarity that comes when people are given enough space to reveal their full intentions without interruption. When she finally paused again, her expression composed but expectant, I offered a thoughtful nod. "You have clearly put a lot of thought into this," I said, allowing a hint of appreciation to color my tone, and for a brief moment, something like satisfaction crossed her face, subtle but unmistakable, as though she believed the conversation was moving exactly as planned. I reached for my glass of water, taking a slow sip before setting it down, carefully aligning it with the edge of the table, a small, deliberate movement that gave me just enough time to choose my next words with precision. "It might be helpful for me to review everything on my end as well," I continued, keeping my voice calm, almost reflective. "There are certain arrangements I would want to look at before making any decisions." And Daniel nodded immediately, relieved perhaps that the conversation remained within familiar boundaries. "Of course, that makes sense," he replied, while Vanessa's expression tightened just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough for me to notice, a subtle shift that suggested she had expected less process and more compliance. The conversation moved on after that, lighter topics, small talk about Ethan's school, upcoming holidays, things that filled the space without adding anything of substance. And when they eventually stood to leave, I walked them to the door with the same composed warmth, thanking them for coming, maintaining the rhythm of courtesy that had always defined my role in this family. As I watched them walk back to their car, Vanessa speaking quietly to Daniel, her gestures controlled but purposeful, I understood that in her mind, this had been a productive conversation, a step forward, a confirmation that her assumptions were correct, and I allowed her to keep that belief. Because what she did not see, what she could not yet account for, was that every step she thought she was guiding had already been measured from a place she had not considered. And as I closed the door behind me, the quiet of the house settling once again, I felt no urgency, no need to rush what would come next, because some outcomes are not created through force, but through timing, and I intended to choose mine carefully. The house felt different after they left, not quieter, not emptier, but clearer, as if something unspoken had finally settled into a form I could work with, and I moved through the room slowly, not out of hesitation but out of awareness, noticing details I had stopped seeing over the years, the way the afternoon light fell across the dining table, the faint mark on the wall where Daniel had once dragged a chair as a boy, the small imperfections that told the truth of time rather than the version people preferred to remember, and I realized that this house had never simply been a place to live. It had been a record, a structure built piece by piece with intention, something far more permanent than the casual plans being made about it over lunch. I paused again at the desk in the hallway, opening the drawer this time without hesitation, and carefully removed the folder I had touched earlier, placing it on the surface with a deliberate steadiness, because there is a moment when thought becomes action, and I had already crossed that line. Inside were documents I had reviewed countless times over the years, property records, financial accounts, letters from my late husband that carried not just sentiment but instruction, and as I turned each page, I was not searching for surprises, only confirming what I already knew, that everything had been structured with foresight, not just for security, but for control, a word people often misunderstand, thinking it harsh or selfish, when in truth it is simply the ability to decide for oneself. I sat down and began making notes, not long explanations, just small, precise reminders, dates, clauses, names, each one aligning into a plan that did not need to be explained to anyone else, because it was not built for discussion. It was built for execution. Over the next few days, I moved quietly through a series of tasks that would have appeared ordinary to anyone watching. A phone call here, an appointment there, brief conversations conducted in measured tones, each one adding a layer of certainty to what I was preparing, and at no point did I rush, because urgency creates mistakes, and I had no intention of leaving anything unfinished. Vanessa sent another message midweek, something light, almost casual, asking if I had given more thought to next steps, and I responded with the same calm consistency, acknowledging her concern, assuring her that I was considering everything carefully, because it was important that she continued to believe in the version of me she had already defined, the one who would eventually agree, the one who would step aside without resistance. By Friday, everything I needed was in place, not dramatically, not in a way that would attract attention, but with a quiet completeness that required no further adjustment, and I spent that evening sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, looking around at the space not with nostalgia, but with clarity, understanding that nothing here was temporary unless I allowed it to be. I thought about the next time we would all sit together, the next gathering where words would be exchanged and assumptions quietly reinforced, and I felt no anxiety, no anticipation that needed to be resolved, only a steady awareness that when that moment came, it would not unfold the way they expected, because while they had been planning how to rearrange my life, I had been ensuring that every piece remained exactly where I chose to place it. And as I set my cup down and turned off the lamp beside me, letting the room fall into a soft darkness, I understood that the most powerful shift had already happened, not in any document or conversation, but within me, because I was no longer reacting to what others intended. I was preparing for what I would decide. The invitation came 2 days later, a simple message from Vanessa suggesting a small family dinner the following weekend, something relaxed, where everyone could spend time together. And I recognized the tone immediately. The casual phrasing meant to imply normalcy, as though nothing of significance had occurred, as though the previous conversations had already settled into a quiet agreement that no longer needed to be addressed directly. And I accepted without hesitation, because this was the moment I had been preparing for, not with anticipation, but with clarity. The evening arrived with the same soft autumn air, the sky dimming earlier now, and when I stepped into their home, I was greeted with the familiar arrangement of carefully curated comfort. The dining table set neatly, candles placed with intention, everything designed to create an atmosphere of warmth that felt just slightly too deliberate, as if it were meant to reinforce a version of reality that had already been decided without question. Vanessa welcomed me with a smile that carried the same polished confidence I had come to expect, her movements precise, her tone light, while Daniel offered a brief embrace, his attention already shifting toward the kitchen, where the final details of the meal were being completed, and I moved through the space with quiet awareness, taking my seat without comment, observing the rhythm of the room, the subtle exchanges, the glances that passed between them when they thought I was not looking. Dinner began smoothly, conversation flowing around safe topics, Ethan speaking excitedly about school, Vanessa adding small remarks that kept everything moving forward, and I listened, contributing just enough to maintain the balance, allowing the evening to unfold exactly as they intended, because it was important that nothing felt forced, nothing felt out of place. When the plates were cleared and the moment naturally shifted towards something more reflective, Vanessa leaned slightly forward, her expression composed, as though she were about to revisit the conversation we had left unfinished, and before she could begin, I reached for my glass, lifting it with a calm, steady motion that drew just enough attention to redirect the room, and for a brief second, there was a pause, the same kind of pause I had felt days earlier, but this time it belonged to me. I would like to say something. I began, my voice even, not raised, not dramatic, just clear. Enough to carry across the table, and I saw the flicker of surprise in Vanessa's eyes, the subtle shift in Daniel's posture as he turned toward me. Unprepared for the change in direction, I let a small breath settle before continuing, not rushing, because timing, as I had learned, is everything. Over the past few days, I have taken the time to review certain arrangements, things that I felt deserved my full attention before making any decisions about the future, I said, choosing each word. With care, watching as their expressions adjusted, curiosity replacing confidence, uncertainty beginning to take shape where certainty had once been. I placed my glass back down gently, the sound soft but deliberate, and reached into my bag, retrieving a single folder, not large, not dramatic, but unmistakable in its presence, and I set it on the table without opening it, allowing it to sit there for a moment, a quiet shift in the center of the room, something tangible where assumptions had previously existed. I thought it would be appropriate to clarify a few things. I continued, my tone unchanged, my posture steady. And in that moment, the atmosphere of the room shifted in a way that could not be undone. Not through laughter, not through deflection, because what they had expected to be a continuation of their plan had just become something else entirely, something they had not prepared for. And as I looked from one face to the other, I understood that this was no longer a conversation about what they believed was best for me, but a moment where they would have to confront what I had already decided for myself. For a moment, no one spoke, the folder resting between us like something far heavier than paper, and I could see the shift happen in real time. The way Vanessa's confidence faltered just slightly, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass, while Daniel leaned forward as if trying to understand what he had somehow missed, and I allowed that silence to settle, because it was no longer uncomfortable for me. It was necessary. I opened the folder slowly, not with drama, but with intention, sliding a single document forward and turning it just enough so they could see, not fully read, but recognize its form, the structure of something official, something final, and I spoke with the same calm steadiness that had carried me through every moment leading up to this one. The house, along with all associated assets, has always remained solely in my name, I said, my voice even, leaving no space for interpretation. And Daniel blinked, confusion crossing his face as though he were trying to reconcile that statement with a belief he had never questioned, while Vanessa's expression sharpened, her composure tightening into something more controlled, more calculated. I continued without raising my voice, because this was not about volume, it was about clarity. In addition to that, I have updated certain provisions to ensure that any decisions regarding my living arrangements, my property, or my finances will be made exclusively by me, without external influence. And I let the words settle, not rushing to fill the space, because understanding does not need to be forced. It arrives when there is nothing left to distract from it. Vanessa was the first to respond, her tone measured but carrying a subtle edge. Margaret, no one is trying to take anything from you. We are just thinking about what is best, she said, and I met her gaze directly, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that did not require approval. I am aware of what you believe is best, I replied, my voice soft but unwavering. That is precisely why I took the time to ensure that those beliefs do not determine my future. And for the first time, there was no easy response to offer, no polite phrasing that could smooth over what had just been made clear. Daniel shifted in his seat, his voice quieter now, uncertain. Mom, we were only trying to help, he said, and I nodded gently, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. Help does not begin with assumptions, I said, allowing a brief pause before continuing. It begins with respect, and the word lingered in the air longer than anything else I had said, because it was the one thing that had been missing long before any of these conversations had taken place. I closed the folder then, not abruptly, just enough to signal that there was nothing further to explain, because everything that needed to be understood had already been said, and I pushed it slightly back toward myself, reclaiming the space it had occupied at the center of the table. And as I stood, smoothing my hands lightly over the fabric of my coat, I felt no need to wait for a response, no need to hear what they might say next, because the outcome no longer depended on their agreement. I looked at Daniel for a moment, really looked at him, not as the boy I had raised, but as the man he had become, and there was no anger there, only a quiet recognition of distance, of choices made and not made. And then I turned toward Vanessa, offering the same composed expression I had given her at the very beginning. I will continue to make decisions that reflect my own judgment, I said simply. And with that, I walked toward the door, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. And when I stepped outside into the cool evening air, the weight I had carried so quietly for so long no longer followed me, because it had never been about proving anything to them. It had been about reminding myself that what I built, what I maintained, and what I chose to protect was never something that could be reassigned without my consent. And as I walked to my car, the soft sound of leaves shifting beneath my feet, I understood with complete certainty that respect is not something that can be negotiated after it has been withheld. It is something that must be recognized from the beginning. And if it is not, then walking away is not a loss, it is a decision.